Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Dr. Andreas Schloenhardt to you. Andreas is a good old friend of mine because both of us, we have the pleasure and the honor to teach at the summer school of the University of Vienna, normally every late July and early August. So normally we would be in Strobel, close to Wolfgangsee together. Unfortunately, both of us are in Vienna now, but it's a real pleasure and an honor to have you here with us, Andreas. Andreas is a honorary professor of criminal law at the University of Vienna, but in his main profession, he's professor of criminal law at the University of Queensland School of Law in Brisbane in Australia. Andreas was born in, I think he was born, at least he was educated in Germany. He spent his early education and early career in Germany. He did the state examination in Augsburg in Bavaria, which is, for the Germans who are listening to us, of course, one of the most prestigious ways to start a legal career in Germany. He was then a research staff at the University of Augsburg in Germany, but then he moved to Australia in the late 90s, first as a research associate, and then later as a lecturer, and then later as a professor of law at the University of Queensland, where he has been teaching and researching now since 2005. And it's really an honor for the University of Vienna to be one of the places in Europe. It's not the only place, but for me, obviously, it's the most important place that was attractive enough, Andreas, to convince you of teaching and doing some work here as well, and not only in Australia. So very, very good to have you here. May I start with a very naive first question, which is, how come that a German lawyer becomes an academic in Australia? What were the most important paths in your career, and how did you do this?
Well, hello, Nikki, and thank you so much for having me today. It's a great privilege to be invited to this conversation, and hello to everybody else as well. You've put all these flowers in front of me about my career, and so now I have to pick up some of those blossoms and throw them away or explain them a little bit more. Look, it's perhaps less adventurous or mysterious or scandalous than people may think. And perhaps knowing that many of our listeners might be lawyers or law students, I, as you mentioned, started my law degree in southern Germany, in Augsburg, at a time when people moved around the country in Germany to do their degree. I'm originally from the northwestern part, near Düsseldorf. So it came as a shock to me to go to a place where I've never been before and start a degree that I knew very little about. And frankly, I have the same experience with many of the students that I teach in first year. When you start law school, you know very little about what's ahead of you, because it's something that you're not really exposed to when you do your year 12 or anywhere in high school. And so you're thrown into this cold water that's called the law. And now it's up to you to make sense of that. And for me, in my first years, this made very little sense, frankly. And at the risk of popping a few balloons now, I really hated my law degree when I started it. And the fact that I would, become a professor many years later was certainly not on the radar when I started. It was an act of desperation. And it was perhaps an act of desperation, of flight, when I went to Australia in 1994, and essentially never left since that time. Like many, I went there as a backpacker to explore the sunshine and the beaches. I had friends there, had some connections to the country before, but that was my first visit. And I was lucky enough to meet some people who did study law in Australia and who took me along to experience the way that law was taught there. And my changing really changed very quickly, because it's a very different way of educating people, of interacting between students and with staff, than what I've experienced at one of those big universities in Germany at the time. And so the seed was planted that I want to do everything possible to, shift my studies and myself to Australia. And I was very fortunate that I had a scholarship during my undergraduate studies, and that a German think tank enabled me to study abroad. And so I did much of my undergraduate degree at the University of Adelaide in South Australia back then. I did return, as you mentioned, to Munich some years later to do the state examination, but at that time I already knew that I was going to stay in Australia, do a PhD, and then, you know, go on the path that I've been on ever since. You know, you made it sound so fancy, all the things that I've done, but I look at it like I've never left university, right? I'm still here where I am many, many years later, but I must say I am genuinely enjoying it.
Yeah, I think we have two things in common here. The first one is that both of us hated law studies, and both of us ended up in never doing anything else than university. However, I mean, Australia is quite far from Germany, I would assume. Also, when it comes to the legal system as a whole, right? So it's as far as I know, everything. So the big picture and also every single detail is very different from what you might have known from your German backgrounds and your German roots. So what were the most astonishing or most stunning experiences with the legal system in Australia when you arrived there, and which are still stunning and astonishing after more than 25 years there now for you?
Look, if you put it this way, I think the most astonishing thing is that things aren't all that different after all. Mm-hmm. And now keep in mind, I'm a criminal lawyer, so I have a little lens how I look at the law and the sorts of laws that I've encountered. You know, I'm not an expert on criminal procedure, on civil procedure and other matters where there might be differences that I'm not even very well aware of. But let me just take two examples. One is, of course, the criminal law, where we have this tradition across continental Europe of having codified criminal law going back to the French system. The Italians were great leaders in codifying criminal law in the late 19th century. And this idea spread into the English system very early on. Some listeners may know that the UK itself experimented with substituting the common law with the penal code in the 1850s. This never materialized in London, but it did in the colonies, most notably in India, where the Indian penal code became a template for the rest of the world. And this also sparked some ideas in Australia, where criminal law in most parts is codified in the sense that you work with one statute that has general principles and special offenses. So there are indeed very many similarities between the way certainly this part of the law is set up. And we actually see similar trends in the United States as well, where codification of criminal law has a long tradition. So my first point is here, the differences aren't perhaps as significant as it may seem on the surface. Secondly, also when it comes with engaging with the country, and I guess one thing that fascinates me about the law in a non-academic way is how me as a citizen gets to understand how a country operates. How do we organize our administration? How are decisions being made? How, you know, within which framework is politics carried out? And if you look at the sort of system of government that Australia has and its constitution in particular, you have a federal system that is essentially a mixture of Switzerland, Germany, and the United States combined. And the way in which the separation of powers work is a way in which, you know, Parliament operates. And perhaps the whole system of government is not too dissimilar to the way that we know it, and is perhaps more European than the true British system as we know it. So while it is an exotic place with, you know, dangerous animals and more sunshine than we usually experience in this corner of the world, in terms of the legal system, it isn't quite as foreign as it seems. And I would think, and having taken many students from Austria to Australia over the years, they are generally quite aware after some time that the differences and gaps aren't as great as they feared when they first set sail for Australia.
But I would assume that they are still significant when it comes to the educational system per se, right? So the way the law is taught might be rather different.
Right. The academic system is quite different to what we have here in Austria or in Germany as well. First of all, it is what we refer to as the Bologna system, the combination of bachelor and master's. Though similar to the UK, it suffices to have a bachelor's degree to practice law. I did much of my undergraduate degree in the 1990s, when the system was a little bit different to what it became later on, because traditionally the legal education in Australia was more like the United States system. So that you have some generic university education, often in the humanities, the arts, or the social sciences, or liberal arts education before you go into law school. So law school as an idea of a sort of postgraduate qualification, much of how medicine is still taught at many universities. You have a generic higher degree before you move into the specialized field to broaden your horizon. And this is how the traditional system was set up. And at the time when I studied, it was such that you would start with your arts education and then shift into the law degree after 1 year of study. So essentially, you can do these 2 degrees parallel. And that's much the tradition today, at least at the sort of Ivy League universities, the old sandstone universities, as we call them, around Australia, that have this dual degree education. So maybe 5% of the students that I teach in Brisbane do a standalone degree, but the vast, vast majority study 2 degrees at the same time. Popular combinations are, political science and law, international relations and law, or business and commerce and law, but also more exotic things like journalism and music and architecture and all the sciences and law in combination. It makes for a much longer degree. Students on average would spend 6 to 6.5 years at the university and come out with 2 qualifications, usually 2 bachelor degrees. Mm-hmm. And with that, I think they have the benefit of having qualifications in 2 fields and have a broader spectrum of opportunities ahead of them as well. And what we see in our graduates, and someone who is not in a more commercial area of the law is very pleased to see that many of our graduates go into government, go into international organizations, go into the business sector, and that we're not just a factory for people turning out to be barristers or solicitors. Right?
Okay, but let me just to clarify this or to understand it a little bit better. So if I wanted to become a business lawyer, the best way to do this would be to do an undergraduate in law plus economics or something like this. I would end up after 6 years with 2 bachelors, and then I would go into practice. Would that be the way?
If you were my son, then that would be the advice that I give you. This is certainly the most sound education you can get. It takes a long time, and keeping in mind that tuition fees are quite high in Australia, this will be very expensive. One thing that has changed, I alluded to this briefly earlier, is that around the year 2000, the government, as a cost-saving measure, made it mandatory for universities to offer a standalone law degree. And many of the modern universities, many of which were changed from technical universities or teaching institutions into universities in the late 1990s, now offer standalone law degrees that you can usually complete within 4 years. And then you end up with a bachelor's degree only. You have all the qualifications you need to go to court, to go into practice, to sit your bar exam, or the Australian equivalent. And this is certainly where a great number of lawyers are being produced. But maybe it's just showing my age and my own experience, but I'm a strong believer of this sort of co-educational system. And particularly for lawyers, I do find it very important that they do get some experience outside the sort of very narrow cage that the law can be. And if I can just add that point, and I hope this is no offense to any of our listeners, looking at our students that we teach in Vienna, as you know, there is a small percentage of students that we have in law that study a second degree as well. And I find that highly beneficial, and I often find the intellectual capacity of those students who have some experience in another discipline is really helpful in their research, in their interaction. And so my advice to any young person would be study as much as you can.
Yeah, but in Vienna, it's clearly the exception. But in your law school in Australia, if I understood you correctly, it's the rule. So 95% of the students do both, right? Yeah. And could that be because it's such an elite school that you are teaching in?
It is. We have this. I have to be careful how I word this. I don't want to sound, too elitist in this. But I use the sort of US comparison, and that may make sense to some of our listeners. In the United States, people will be aware with the idea of the Ivy League of universities, a small set of universities that were established a long time ago and that live by reputation, and that also, I guess, see themselves more as postgraduate and research institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a similar set of universities in Australia, and they are referred to as the G8 in reference to the group of 8 of big economies. And it is the number 8 of universities that come together here. These are all the so-called sandstone universities that were established usually about 100, 150 years ago. Their funding model is also a little bit different in that much of their income comes through research grants, through postgraduate education and PhDs, and where undergraduate education may amount for roughly about 40, 50% of their income. It's different to those new universities, of which there are, I think, 31 at the moment, that focus very heavily on teaching large cohorts of students and have a much smaller research component into the sort of academic work that their faculty is undertaking.
So how many students apply each year at your university, and how many do you take of them?
This is an important and highly political question. You do apply to a central authority within each state of Australia that takes these applications and then ranks students. So you do nominate which university you want to go to, and then the cutoff score will be set depending on the number of applications. Now, we have made a lot of effort at UQ, the University of Queensland, in recent years to lower the numbers and to have a more personalized learning experience, and also moving away from big lectures to smaller seminar-style teaching, even in core courses. And with that, we've reduced the intake of first-year students to around about 225. Mm-hmm. For those places, we would probably get approximately 3,000 applications.
Mm-hmm. So, and the 2,800 who do not succeed in applying at the University of Queensland go to one of the newer ones, to one of the 31 others.
Absolutely. This is the beauty of capitalism. We have many universities. Brisbane is a city of around about 3.5 million people. And in Brisbane alone, we do have 5 law schools, competing law schools, that offer slightly different products as well. And some people may choose to go to one or the other, not only because of the score, but there is fierce competition to, of course, get the best possible students and have the highest cutoff in terms of their scores.
And how do those 5 compete? So what are the factors that are decisive here? Is it the prestige of the staff, or is it?
It is, to a degree. I mean, the law degree is not specialized in any way. So I'm not aware that students really think, you know, they are better in constitutional law and these are better in contract law. I think that doesn't matter for an 18-year-old that goes to university. Location has perhaps something to do with that. Since we do this dual degree system only, this is, of course, a big factor for some because they want to study 2 degrees and qualify accordingly. It might be a deterrent to others who say, I want to get my qualification as quickly as possible to then start working at the age of 22 or 23. Also, if you look at further study, people who want to go into research or master's program or even overseas experience might aim for a more elite university than the other. But we have a large pool of applicants and school leavers. So all of these places are filled very, very quickly.
Yeah, I see. And those 220 succeeding, they need to pay quite high fees, don't they? So what's the average fee per year?
They do indeed. The tuition fees in Australia are notoriously high. And unfortunately, due to the developments of this year, have been raised significantly higher for future generations. This does not make me particularly happy. It does vary between degree, of course, but for domestic Australian students, as far as I remember the figure correctly, it is approximately 10,000 Australian dollars per semester. So that's roughly about 7,500 euro. I must add, though, this number is very high, and it does cause many problems for people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds or from regional areas. And that's another discussion to be had. But what needs to be said here is that Australia operates this on a loan system. So essentially, you accumulate debt while you're studying. And then that debt has to be repaid to the state once you hit a certain level of income after graduation, and it's taken back from you by way of taxes.
Yeah.
Instills, I mean, this is highly contested and debatable, of course, the details of this, but it tries to ensure a sort of minimum of fairness and equity in all of this. Right?
Do you have a significant amount of dropouts? Because for them,
no. So we don't. There's a lot to be said about this, good things and bad things, but perhaps just to note a few key points. We don't have any drop points because of the high entry requirements that ensures that you have people who know how to learn. They're not all brilliant minds, don't get me wrong, but they're very studious and they can absorb and process information, which is useful in a law degree in particular. And it's few that really drop out altogether. What we do find is that some people often say, look, I enjoy, I don't know, the science is much more than law, so I go on this other path and I drop out of the law degree. So they change their career ever so slightly. And I would take a bet that if I would ask any of my students, how much are you paying per semester for your degree? They wouldn't even know. This is not something that was really on their horizon, that they think about those fees and how much it will cost when they decide to go to university and how they then design their degree. What is a big problem is that people from rural areas, from indigenous backgrounds, and from lower socioeconomic backgrounds don't even consider the idea of going to university in the first place. The long periods of time, the costs are one deterrent, but also that the schools don't adequately prepare them to get those high enough scores to enter university in the first place. Plus, of course, which we know from Austria as well, that the family background matters a lot as to whether a child decides to go to university or not.
And if you have those 220 entering school every year, how many professors are on the other side of them? So what is the ratio, professor versus students?
I can't
roughly. So, or tell me the difference to us. I mean, you have a day-to-day experience with this because you are teaching criminal law in Vienna, so that is probably a rather different experience.
Yeah. It's a very different experience being in a lecture theater here, believe me. But so we have roughly around about 1,100, 1,200 undergraduate students in the School of Law. And that's vis-a-vis around about 45 full-time academic staff, plus casual teachers. So this is, I guess it's an ordinary ratio for an Australian university. It's impossible to compare this to the sort of ratios that we have here in Vienna or in other Central European universities, because we just deliver courses here very differently.
Yeah, and in how far differently? So I would assume that the typical teaching style in Australia is a class situation and where you have 20, 25 students and it's very interactive and you're using, I don't know, Socratic methods and so on. And students are expected to actively contribute, which is not always the case in Vienna or in similar universities, I would assume. Do you think that the crisis that we are facing will change anything in Central Europe here? More leading us into the dialogue style and smaller groups?
Oh, if you had asked me the question before the crisis, I would have said, yes, there was a trajectory. We were on a path to doing this more and more. My experience, and I've been in Vienna for 7 or 8 years now, is that the sort of more interactive style of teaching has become more popular here. I think the appointment of new staff, yourself included, has contributed to this, that people adopt more of a style where they engage students, that the sort of sitting anonymously in a lecture theater is a thing of the past, and that we work with the people a lot more and get them to talk, to discuss, to group work and whatnot. So I feel like there's also, I guess, a new generation of teachers and doctoral assistants who are helping our teaching here in Vienna, who are bringing about this change. It's difficult to see how this year in particular, and this sort of combination of online and face-to-face teaching we will have next semester, will change that in the medium and long term. Part of me fears that it will throw us back some years, because you can reach so many more people online than you can in any one room, right? So that we don't have to teach them at different times, because we can broadcast this to the world all at once. I'm also a little bit mindful, and this is, I have Australia in mind when I say this, is that economically there will be severe cuts, and that the staff-student ratio will suffer greatly in the future, that we need to teach greater classes simply because it's cheaper. That is a genuine fear that I have, a hope that it won't materialize. At the same time, and I guess that's where your question is coming from, Nikki, having done a crash course on online teaching in the last 6 months, like so many of us, I have had some wonderful experience with students, with small group teaching. I have, by way of example, taught one seminar here in Vienna with students I've never met before, because the first sort of planning meeting, the Vorbesprechung, was after the lockdown. And so the first time we met was via Zoom. And the entire course was taught online. Students had to undertake independent research, present online using electronic media, and producing videos of their presentations. And I had the greatest fears how this would work in having them engaged, having them discuss, and delivering something that is a presentable product. And I was genuinely impressed how much effort they put in there, how well they as a group also cooperated, having never met in person before. Maybe I was just lucky with those 15 students I had in the course.
Don't think so. It's a generation thing.
It was delightful. And just to finish off this little sort of delightful stories, so they presented online, and then when the lockdown ended, so about 3 weeks ago, we all met up at the pub outdoor. And it was just wonderful to see them all and for them to come together as a group. I guess everyone is looking forward to having the sort of human element again that's missing in teaching. But at the same time, the sort of digital world does offer some modes of delivery that certainly can complement what we've done to this day. And I guess to close the circle a little bit, if it does mean we can engage students more, we can foster more group work, and have more interaction and share the sort of learning load with students, then that will be a fantastic development. Fingers crossed that things will go.
Yeah. And if you could compare this with the situation at the University of Queensland, so I mean, I would assume that probably there was a lockdown there, just like here, and did students and staff react similarly, like they reacted here in Vienna, or were there any major differences?
It was pretty much exactly the same in terms of the lockdown and the rollout of online learning. We had one small benefit as an academic, you would appreciate that. We were given one course week to make that change from face-to-face teaching to online learning. And that was great to just have that time to think about how am I going to do this, rewrite your course profile. And in my case, I recorded many of my lectures in Australia before I fled to Vienna in late March. I guess one thing that is very different, and this doesn't affect online learning alone, it's a point you made earlier. Given the small numbers, and may I also say, given the nature of Australians, who I think are genetically very extroverted, there is a very different staff-student relationship in our classrooms. The rapport is very different, and students, and I guess this probably goes back to the high school experience even, are very, very forward with you as a staff member in how they ask questions, in how they deal with you. Australians are known to address everyone on a first name basis. And I would be insulted if a student in Australia would call me Professor Schloenhardt, because it usually means they are complaining about something. So seeing eye to eye and having absolutely no shame in working with complete strangers and with new people is, I think, a unique gift that you find in these students. You don't need any icebreakers to make them come together as a group. And that makes our lives as faculty a whole lot easier. I know you've taught many of my students in Strobel as well, and may have had a similar experience. And I don't want to say this as a criticism of the students I teach here in Vienna. I just think that there are a few circumstances that enable one development or the other. In Vienna, we are an incredibly large institution in a very big city, operating on many different campuses. You know, you and I are not in the law school. Many of our colleagues are in different buildings again. So there isn't this sort of campus experience that you would have in Australia. Students have often grown up in Vienna and they have their circle of friends well before they go to university. So the desire to mingle and socialize might be lower. And they can just sit in the classroom and then disappear in the first district and do their shopping or sip a coffee, and don't have this sort of living and breathing the university space as we do this in Australia. And I do think in the medium term, it's something that we as an institution here in Vienna and us as academics need to think a little bit about how we establish this relationship with our students and how can they develop some sense of ownership for their studies, a sense of belonging to the university. That's, and given all the distractions that we have in Vienna, is a difficult thing to achieve, but I think a lot would be achieved if we had a better tie and the students a better tie to us.
Yeah, which would require probably more time on both sides, in particular also on the teaching side, which brings me to the question, how important is teaching for the average academic career? I would assume that Australia puts a lot, or Australian professors put more effort by default into teaching because it's more important for their own career than it might be in Europe or in Austria. Would that be correct?
Look, I'll give you my answer, and then you can make the comparison. And there is one major point of difference is that, and this is sort of the generation that I am in, and I started teaching in the late 1990s. We were the first sort of academics that had to undertake teacher training. Okay, so we really were the first to think about pedagogy and how to communicate information to other people, how to use certain visual aids and engage with students, think about assessment and whatnot. And of course, this has been developed much further since. You know, one of my PhD students recently became an academic in Australia, and it's a lot more intensive now what they ask for, but also the trainings that you give. And I think that the positive thing, you know, some of the professors I think back, you know, really had no idea about how they would communicate their ideas, and they were brilliant intellectual minds, but they weren't great presenters, frankly. And so that's been, I guess, held in higher regard in Australia than it is here or has been here traditionally. Of course, student evaluations play an important role. That's the same here in Vienna. Can you really build a career on teaching alone? No. Really, the big universities look at your research much more than they do at your teaching. You can explain a lot of things away in terms of your teaching. You can't do that in terms of your research. Really.
Yeah, so the typical career then starts with the bachelor that you mentioned before. Then you're expected to write a PhD that needs 4 to 5 years, and then you are on the market and you can apply.
Yeah, that's the sort of, we compared to Austria, there's far fewer people in law that will undertake a PhD. If you make that decision to do a PhD, you've essentially made the decision to become an academic. Mm-hmm. You don't do this if you want to become a lawyer or anything. People don't collect titles like they do here, and it really doesn't help you. Perhaps in the public service, if you research a particular field in which the public sector has a particular demand and perhaps jobs, but the number of PhD scholars is a whole lot smaller than it is here. And back in the days, I remember some of the people who taught me, they didn't even have postgraduate qualifications. And research wasn't quite as important as it is now, and with that, the sort of research portfolio that you build. But that has undergone a dramatic change in the last 20, 25 years, that without a PhD, you will not be appointed at a major university, even as a junior academic.
Mm-hmm. And is the career per se attractive for bright people? So is it easy to find young scholars willing to write a PhD?
Look, this is no different to what it is here. I'm like yourself. I like to mentor young students. I love to supervise in the sense that there's someone who works on a topic, gets to the bottom of this, and that's where I think you get the student to a point where you can have a discussion eye to eye, and you learn something from them, and they can challenge your own ideas. And that's an experience I tremendously enjoy. Finding the right people is a challenge. It always is. There's lots of people who want to collect a title, who want to have a PhD, but don't really know how to do that and are not really interested in research. And so you kind of got to find the right caliber of people. My view is, and I would say the same to an Australian student, and I would say the same to a student here in Vienna, is if you have an interest in research, and if you have the intellectual capacity to do that, you can use the PhD to develop your next job as an academic, or work in a field that's interesting to international organizations or whatnot. You know, I do most of my work as an international criminal law, and I've seen so many of my graduates go into the United Nations system, which is very attractive in Vienna because they're just down the road. And I think if you put your heart and mind to this, then you can do that, and you're not just getting a PhD that's catapulting you into unemployment. So I think those years of the PhD are really also to network, to find out about the world around you, and build yourself a portfolio that can be attractive to your next employer, be it academic or otherwise. That's my take, and that's been my experience. Others might have experienced very different.
Yeah, but I would assume that the average entry age for people to start to work independently in academia is significantly lower in Australia than it is in Austria. And the personal risks, therefore, that you take with going that career path might be lower. Therefore, I think that's one of the problems of the Austrian system at the moment, that you really take a high risk that you end up in your late 30s with no tenure position.
True. There are some, institutional obstacles and deficiencies that make career progression in academia easy in Austria. You and I know them, and for people who've acquired their PhD, to take the next step is a tremendous challenge, and is not made easy by all the rules around that. But going a few steps back, there is one other difference in the Australian system, that students start school usually at the age of 5. And so with 12 years of school, we have some students who enter university at the age of 17. There's not very many, but depending on what time of the year you're born in, that can happen. If they study at one of the modern universities, they can have a law degree age 21 or 22, if they really see this through on a straight path. Ours with a dual degree will take a couple of years more. So yes, they are in their early 20s, their world is their oyster, and they can make a few mistakes. Still, that would be very difficult for an Austrian students to do it in that time. And if they enter the PhD straight after their first law degree, that would usually be in their late 20s, even on 30 by the time they graduate, and then enter the real job market. And that is challenging. But I would say, and I'm cautious saying this, that there are some obstacles in the Austrian system that should be addressed, and that make academia a much more attractive career path. I think everyone would benefit from that, and it would probably attract some better people as well, and have a higher demand on PhDs, and rightly so.
Mm-hmm. And that brings me to the question about how the universities are organizing themselves, and how decision making is done at both places. What would be the main difference that you see?
Look, now I hope that the president of the University of Vienna is listening, and that our dean is listening when I say this. And the whole experience of the last 6 months, I think, has fortified my opinion. And what I'm going to say now is not very kind, but there's no harm in being candid. What I've seen, and I've lived in Australia for the better part of the last 25 years, is a change away from public institutions that were places of liberal education and free minds, and may I say freedom of speech, to something that is much more of a corporate entity. The financial pressures on Australian universities are enormous as government has withdrawn more and more of their funding. And this has become significantly worse this year, and I'll come back to this in a moment. But even prior to the challenges that the year 2020 poses, it is such that many universities have adopted a very executive organizational style and a very hierarchical system of governance. In my law school alone, and I'm not blaming my immediate superiors for this, there are single executives that make far-reaching decisions. There is no committee structure. There is no voting. There is no sense of me contributing to the decision-making or my voice being heard. There are decisions made at the top, mostly by the Vice-Chancellor himself, that affect everyone. So a really top-down approach. And I'm also saying this because as the events of this year unfolded, this was very much felt by staff and students. And I would say there was a bit of disrespect also to the difficult situations that many of us were facing as this pandemic was unfolding. And life was changing from one day to the next. People were losing their jobs. The perspective of illness and incarceration came around. And so having this style of running a place certainly didn't help much. Keep in mind though, and this is the financial element I alluded to earlier, that Australian universities are currently facing a major disaster because of the fallout from tuition fees from the COVID crisis. Much of the income that we generate comes from foreign students, and they just didn't come this year. Most of them from China. So around about 15 to 20% of the university income of my university comes from Chinese students alone. We are facing this year alone a loss of 240 million Australian dollars, around about 200 million euro. And this money isn't coming from anywhere else, and it's certainly not coming from government. So a lot of casual staff has been discontinued. People who are on contract will not have their contract renewed. Australian universities are believed to be dismissing 21,000 people this year alone. So I'm saying this, and I'm saying this with a really heavy heart, because I don't know how this will affect my colleagues and myself in the near future. There will be people who will lose their tenure and who will be made redundant. And this is something that none of us would have ever foreshadowed. And so to end this little segment on a high note, looking at the way I've experienced this here in Vienna, and I'm on staff at 2 universities in Switzerland as well, and I see all these emails. This has been a much more collegial way of communicating a crisis, of showing understanding to staff, to students, as well as all of us had no idea what was ahead of us in March and how us and our families would go through this. Everyone was flying blind, but I felt that here's a university was acknowledging that and was going a much more cautious approach and was honest about their own lack of experience, their own gaps at that time, and saying, hey, this is new for us as well. We're all learning, we're all flying blind. Let's do this together. And of course, now that perhaps we can grasp a part of this crisis a little bit better, it's pleasing to see that, I guess, as academics in Austria, we are reasonably safe for the foreseeable future so the government has not said we're going to save money and recoup some of our expenses by cutting university jobs or lowering the number of places or subsidies. By contrast, I think there might even be a higher demand on universities, and that's a positive outcome for us. So two worlds apart. And so, this is the question that you and I discussed prior to the recording of this. Where would you rather be at this point in time? And I'm genuinely very happy to be here in Vienna right now.
I mean, my feeling about the situation in Vienna at the moment is that nobody would really expect this to have a negative impact on career of staff that is already here. So that is completely out of question, I would say. I think the contrary is true, which is that people are aware. I mean, people meaning general politics are aware of that this way of teaching requires at least the same amount of people and at least the same amount of effort. So I don't think that, personally, I don't think that there is any serious risk of crisis for the whole system here in Vienna, which is very different from what you are telling me about the situation in Australia. And I have several questions here. The first one would be, is that legal? I mean, could it be that you are simply fired as a senior academic because of such a pandemic? I mean, is that in line with, you know, fundamental rights, freedom of speech, freedom of research, and all this, and you know, the boring European standards here? And if it were legal, what will the factors be that will be decisive? Is it the individual performance, or is it the subject taught, or is it the social situation of the staff, or what will be the factor here?
The first answer, I think, is a simple yes. In this particular crisis, and given the scale of the losses that the universities are making right now, they will have no choice but to go this way. They can't accumulate debt, and the government has said they're not going to bail them out. What they have done, and this might help some universities to stay above water, is that they can increase tuition fees, which of course, this is doing it on the back of our students. And there are some details to that, we can talk about this if you want, that are highly unpleasant, but it may save some universities, particularly those that are in high demand by students. And of course, I guess with the high unemployment that we will be facing, there will be a rise of demand in people going to university. Mm-hmm. So that might be other universities, however, and I'm not going to name them, are facing a crisis of a scale that they may close down altogether. And that staff will be dismissed and the university might be disintegrated. These are universities who have difficult financial situations in the past, that haven't been operating for a long time and don't have any assets in terms of property or whatnot. But there is a crisis of a sort that no one anticipated. Now, I'm saying this being full well aware that there's many other industries that are facing similar crises. So we need to put this in perspective as well.
But doesn't that lead to a political meltdown? I mean, if universities need to close in a country that is not really, I would imagine that would put any European government under very serious pressure.
Look, I can't really answer this, and because I've been away for much of this crisis, and this is nothing that I have seen in the Australian media, and the Australian media is not of a very high quality when it comes to this, discussed very publicly. The focus has been on the public health crisis for now, and what the ramifications will be is yet to be seen. So the only rescue package really the government has offered is the astronomical increase in tuition fees that are averaging 28% in fees for students in coming years. So this is a massive extra burden that students and their families will have to bear in the foreseeable future. Whether this will be enough to save them, much will depend on whether international students can return next year and how many of them will return. There will be a big slimming down, and it will depend on how many people can you make redundant who are casual and who are on contract, where you don't have any obligations to keep them on board. Do I fear for my job right now? Probably not, and I'm not sure. And my university has communicated a few things that they might do things a bit differently. But what they have also said is that my teaching load will increase considerably to cover that and to save money, right? And of course, savings also in terms of events, of travel, of other expenditures where the university just doesn't have any money in the bank anymore.
And staff accepts this because there is no choice, right? So there is no.
Yes, I'm hesitant with some answers because I'm just not sure that I'm across all of this. I know that the union has had negotiations with government to say offer people a pay cut, but keep them on board. Mm-hmm. And as far as I know, universities have the option to lower your salary by up to 15%, but keep you on board at full workload. So not the Kurzarbeit model, but really saying we're saving your job and you have to work as much as you used to, but at a lower rate. Of course, that's not very good for staff morale. And so some universities have said, we're not going to do this to our people, and they're not going to show up for work anymore. They're going to be really lazy. What's the incentive, in all of this? So I think it will depend on how long this crisis lingers. And without wanting to be too dramatic, many listeners will know that at this very moment, it's looking very dark in Australia because the numbers are going through the roof in some parts of the country. So it's anyone's guess how normality will return somehow.
Yeah, and are there any strategic plans happening at the universities at the moment? I mean, I would expect that at least the next term will not be a normal one, and it's very, very unclear what's going to happen then. And if the crisis is already that imminent, who is doing the homework of all the escalation scenarios that might come up out of this?
I'm sure there's a lot of people working on just that. And as much as I've painted a very dark picture, I know that people, many of them within the university and in government and among staff and unions, I guess they all want the best outcome for this. There's no doubt about this. We have just had a change of leadership at my university on the 1st of this month. So there's a new vice chancellor who is now steering the ship. So it's difficult for me to predict what he personally might do. But when it comes down to the day-to-day experience, and I'm taking some of the drama away from what we've just discussed, it is much the same as what we experience here. The second semester in Australia, being in the Southern Hemisphere, has just started now, this week. And it's a very similar model that we envisage for Vienna for the fall, a combination of face-to-face and online teaching, depending on class sizes, giving some students choices whether they want to attend class on campus or online, to encourage face-to-face teaching in small groups and particularly sort of research-based and group learning, and require some on-campus presence in so long as it's possible. While I've been so dramatic about development in Australia, Queensland at this point in time is almost COVID-free, and life is relatively normal, though borders are tightly closed. So for the time being, they think they can run a quasi-normal semester in the way that we planned this, starting in October. And I'm praying and hoping that they can see this through and that we can see this through as well, and that will be the first step towards normality in 2021.
Yeah, which is, I don't want to challenge this too much, but I find it, if I may say so, rather astonishing that everyone pretends that this is the way to go, because the figures would be acceptable. I think from an individual perspective, the figures are not acceptable if you are the one infected, right? And I would, and I mean, it's a very dangerous disease also for young people. It can be a very dangerous disease for young people. And I find it very striking that, different from March and April, when everyone tried to get the figures as low as possible, the overall perception at the moment is, well, provided that it doesn't explode, everything is fine, or at least acceptable, is strange. So I don't know. I don't know where this comes from, and I don't know whether this is really the convincing way to deal with it at the moment. But I see that many people do it like this. So
yeah. Look, I'm not a virologist, so I'm reserving.
This is not it's not a question to a virologist. It's more a question to an expert of public law, right? So and or an ethicist, if you want, right? Or a teacher, right? So what exactly is the risk that society is ready to take and ready to ask the individual to take, right?
Well, I guess that's the point. How do we manage that risk? I'm glad I'm not the decision maker, and I'm very fortunate to only have very small classes in the next semester here in Vienna. which we will hopefully be able to teach face-to-face with some online component. I guess we'll have to just see what it's going to be like. We're obviously catering for all sorts of scenarios at the moment, and we're certainly better prepared than we were back in March. A lot of us have learned a lot. And I do believe, this is kind of going back in our conversation a little bit, and I'm a little bit worried that our listeners will come out of this conversation all doom and gloom. So I'm trying to use a bit of cheer here and there where we can. Looking a little bit more long term and perhaps looking at next year, and I'm wearing an optimistic hat saying this, I think we can come out of this as academics, as teachers, having learned a bunch of new things. And may I say, you've been a pioneer on many of these things for some time, and we've learned from you as well, Nikki. But to combine different modes of delivery, I've been a little bit shocked also how some colleagues, were completely unfamiliar with things like Moodle or with other learning platforms, who have been around for some time, and who, even if you're the fiercest opponent of online learning, there are certain tools that will make your life easier and those of your students. When it comes to posting notes online, to recording lectures, I've been much against this in the past myself, thinking I don't want to have everything I say recorded. I may make inappropriate jokes that I regret the next day, and then everyone's listening to say, oh my Lord. But I've learned to mitigate those risks, and perhaps also not to fear the worst every time. And that there are some of these elements that we can easily use in the future that are additional learning tools that students can benefit from, and that will probably linger around all the time, even if COVID becomes a thing of the past, that these things will be there. And I would be hopeful that we can do this not at the expense of face-to-face teaching and the human element, but that it's a combination of both that we can use to the best advantage of teaching and learning. And in the end, and this is coming back to a point we've made a few times by now, really enhance the engagement with students, their cooperation with us and with each other, and perhaps develop a bit more of the rapport that we've sometimes been missing in the past. Is that a hopeful enough note?
It could be. I don't know. I mean, but if I may, I will again put some water into this wonderful wine, which is, personally, I find it very interesting to see that each and every one of us is going through this exercise now individually, right? So all of us start to learn how Moodle works, or how PowerPoint presentations can be put online, or whether it makes any sense to pre-record something and so on. And all of us, we are very, very free in doing so, right? And the institution per se doesn't invest too much time in organizing our individual thinking and in organizing our individual approaches, and that's something I find rather interesting to see, because I think it's a very significant change in our daily life of teaching and studying that we see, and perhaps it's too early to expect that people start to think about this as a group. But I would assume that in Australia, probably there's even less of this happening, because people are so absorbed by getting everything done, right? So it's probably
we have a longer tradition with how can I put this, with learning platforms. The University of Queensland, perhaps similar to University of Vienna, does not see itself as an online education provider. We don't do distance learning. We have always made a point to be an on-campus university. And this comes back to the question why people choose a particular institution. Our big selling point and our mark and our characteristic was to say, look, if you are the sort of student who wants to be on a campus surrounded by other students learning, who wants to study in the library and experience this sort of physical university life, then that's what we can offer. If you're someone who's working full time, or who's doing their second degree and has kids at home and has to juggle all these competing interests, and then has 2 hours in the evening to learn, then there are other providers who cater for this sort of demand better than we do. But this is not to say that we don't use online learning tools, and in the way that, I'm using Moodle here, and I'm using this quite extensively in Vienna. We've been using the Blackboard platform, which is a little bit more sophisticated, may I say, and offers a few more options than Moodle. And that's been around for the better part of 10 years. I think one thing, so we've been a bit more experienced with that, and the university has been, in their corporate way, very stringent about how we use this and how it is presented to students. And that there is a degree of uniformity when students encounter these platforms, so they know where to look and where to find information. Here, my sense was that the university has been a bit more hands-off, and as you put it, everyone was doing their own thing, which might have led to some confusions for students in this. One professor is doing it this way, the other is doing it this way.
It's 1 o'clock.
So they are, sorry, that's my computer reminding me.
Saying that it's 1 o'clock in the morning in Australia.
Broadcast. But I guess, gives this, I'm being optimistic, it gives us a year or two when I guess we as a university in Vienna as well think, okay, how can we streamline this a little bit, that students know where to look and engage with different modules in a particular way. This has been such a big learning curve, and that's continuing. After all, I think it's a positive thing, and there can be some good things coming out of this in the post-COVID world, and that post-COVID world can't start soon enough.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Andreas, it's more than an hour now that we have been speaking. So your clock reminded us of this, and I don't want to take too much of your time. So let me close this session by thanking you most warmly, but not really closing it before asking you whether there's anything I should have asked you, anything that you would like to add, anything that is specifically important and that I ignored for whatever reason.
No, not at all. Thank you for making the time, for giving me the opportunity. This has been a new format for me and a really interesting and enjoyable conversation. I don't know much about the profile of the listeners. I hope it's been...
Me neither, because they are not communicating too much with us. So
obviously some benefit for them, but I think this is a really useful forum to share some experience, not about just who we are and where we've come from, but certainly the last few months have thrown up a set of experiences and challenges, and it's great to hear how other people have mastered that as well, and they are now.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Andreas. I do hope that both of us are going to have the opportunity to meet in person soon, very soon. Thank you for all your time and all the best for the rest of the summer to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.